Maxwell Harris, or Max as he preferred to be called, was not your average Joe. With his unruly mop of brown hair and a perpetually curious glint in his hazel eyes, he stood out in a crowd. But it wasn't just his appearance that set him apart. It was his insatiable thirst for adventure and his knack for uncovering the unknown. At 26, Max had already made a name for himself in the realm of internet sleuthing. His blog, Unraveling Mysteries with Max, boasted a hefty following of thrill seekers and armchair detectives alike. From haunted houses to UFO sightings, there wasn't a mystery too bizarre for Max to sink his teeth into. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Salem, Massachusetts, when Max's inbox pinged with a new message. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on the keyboard as he read the email from one of his subscribers. "Hey Max, I stumbled upon something you might find interesting. There's this abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town that's rumored to be haunted. They say it's cursed, and no one who enters ever comes out the same. Thought you might want to check it out. Sarah." Max's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. Abandoned psychiatric hospitals were right up his alley, and the prospect of exploring one with a dark history was too tantalizing to resist. Without a second thought, he grabbed his camera, his trusty flashlight, and his backpack, and headed out the door. As he drove towards the outskirts of town, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The air was thick with anticipation, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something truly extraordinary. Pulling up to the rusted gates of the hospital, Max's pulse quickened with excitement. The building loomed before him, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in graffiti. But despite its dilapidated appearance, there was an eerie beauty to the place, a sense of history and mystery that sent a shiver down Max's spine. With a deep breath, Max stepped out of his car and approached the gates. As he reached out to push them open, a cold wind swept through the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. Max froze, his heart pounding in his chest, but then he shook his head, chiding himself for being so easily spooked. "Come on, Max," he muttered under his breath. "You've faced far worse than a little ghost story. Time to see what this place is really hiding." And with that, he pushed open the gates and stepped into the darkness beyond. Max's footsteps echoed through the empty halls of the abandoned psychiatric hospital as he made his way inside. His flashlight cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, illuminating the faded paint and cracked tiles that lined the corridors. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But he pushed aside his unease and pressed on, his curiosity driving him deeper into the heart of the building. As he explored the hospital, Max couldn't help but marvel at the remnants of its past. Rusty gurneys littered the hallways, their wheels creaking eerily as he passed by. Faded photographs hung on the walls, depicting the patients who had once called this place home, their faces frozen in expressions of despair and madness. But it was the silence that unnerved Max the most. There were no birds chirping outside, no distant hum of traffic, only the sound of his own breathing echoing in the empty halls. Suddenly, Max heard a faint whispering coming from somewhere up ahead. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and strained his ears to listen. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and Max realized with a start that it wasn't coming from outside the building, but from within the walls themselves. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max followed the sound, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He rounded a corner and came face to face with a door that had been left slightly ajar. The whispering was coming from inside. Steeling himself, Max pushed open the door and stepped into the room beyond. What he saw took his breath away. The room was filled with rows of empty beds, their mattresses stained and torn. But it wasn't the beds that caught Max's attention. It was the figures that stood huddled in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. As Max's flashlight swept across the room, the figures seemed to melt away. disappearing into the walls as if they had never been there at all. Max stood frozen in shock, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. But before he could gather his thoughts, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into darkness. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he stood alone in the blackness, his senses on high alert. He knew he had to get out of there, but something was holding him back, something dark and powerful that seemed to lurk in the shadows. With a trembling hand, Max reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating the room with a dim, ghostly light. But as he turned to leave, he heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind him. He spun around, his heart in his throat, and saw two glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Max's blood ran cold as he stared into the glowing eyes looming in the darkness. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination, or something far more sinister? Before Max could react, the eyes lunged towards him with a fierce growl. Instinct kicked in, and Max stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he struggled to find the flashlight app. With a click, the room was bathed in light once more, revealing the source of the menacing growl. Before Max stood a creature unlike anything he had ever seen, a hulking figure with matted fur and razor-sharp claws, its eyes burning with an otherworldly rage. Max's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was seeing. Was this some kind of animal that had made its home in the abandoned hospital? Or was it something far more sinister, something that defied explanation? As the creature advanced towards him, Max knew he had to act fast. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, his phone held out like a makeshift weapon. The creature snarled and swiped at him with its claws, but Max dodged out of the way just in time. Thinking quickly, Max backed towards the door, his eyes never leaving the creature's glowing gaze. He knew he had to get out of there before it was too late, but the door was still a few steps away, and the creature was closing in fast. With one final burst of energy, Max sprinted towards the door and threw it open, stumbling out into the hallway beyond. He didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to catch his breath. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him, the sound of the creature's snarls echoing in his ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Max burst out of the hospital and into the cool night air. He collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving with exertion, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. But as he lay there, gasping for breath, Max knew that his ordeal was far from over. Whatever he had encountered in that abandoned hospital was still out there, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Max took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart as he glanced back at the abandoned hospital looming behind him. Maybe it was just his imagination, he thought. Maybe he had been seeing things. But deep down, he knew that what he had encountered in that room was all too real. Pushing aside his fear, Max made his way back into the hospital, his curiosity overpowering his apprehension. He knew there was more to uncover here, more secrets waiting to be revealed. As he explored the deserted corridors, Max's eyes fell upon a door that stood slightly ajar. With a sense of trepidation, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and cramped, the walls lined with rows of metal lockers. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But what caught Max's attention was the desk in the corner of the room, piled high with yellowing papers and faded photographs. With trembling hands, Max began to sift through the documents, his heart pounding in his chest. Most of them were patient records, detailing the treatments and medications prescribed to the residents of the hospital. But as he dug deeper, he came across something far more sinister. Tucked away in the bottom drawer of the desk were a series of classified documents, their contents too shocking to believe. They detailed a series of illegal experiments conducted on the hospital's patients, experiments that had left them scared and traumatized for life. Max's hands shook as he read through the documents, his mind reeling with horror and disbelief. How could something like this have happened? And why had it been covered up for so long? Determined to uncover the truth, Max snapped photos of the documents with his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He knew he had stumbled upon something big, something that could blow the lid off the hospital's dark past. But as he reached for the last document, his heart skipped a beat. It was a list of names of patients who had been subjected to the experiments, names that Max recognized all too well. His blood ran cold as he realized that one of the names on the list belonged to someone he knew, someone whose fate had remained a mystery for years. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max knew that he had to find out what had happened to them, no matter the cost. Max's hands shook as he stared at the list of names, his mind racing with disbelief. Among them was the name of someone he knew all too well, Emily Thompson, a childhood friend who had disappeared without a trace years ago. His heart pounding in his chest, Max couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over him. What had happened to Emily? And what did her name being on this list mean? Determined to find answers, Max made his way back through the hospital, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. He had to find out what had happened to Emily, no matter the cost. As he searched the deserted hallways, Max's mind flashed back to the day Emily had disappeared. They had been inseparable as children, exploring every corner of their small town together. But then, one day, she had vanished without a word, leaving behind only unanswered questions and broken hearts. Max had never stopped searching for her, never stopped hoping that one day he would uncover the truth. And now, it seemed that his chance had finally come. With renewed determination, Max pressed on, his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridors for any sign of Emily. And then, just as he was about to give up hope, he saw it, a faded nameplate on one of the doors, barely visible in the dim light. Emily Thompson, it read, sending a shiver down Max's spine. With a trembling hand, Max pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, the walls lined with empty beds and discarded furniture. But as Max's eyes swept across the room, they came to rest on a photo pinned to the wall, a photo of Emily, smiling brightly as she posed with her arms around her friends. Max's heart clenched as he looked at the photo, memories flooding back to him in a rush. He had missed her so much, had never stopped wondering what had happened to her. But as he reached out to touch the photo, he heard a faint sound coming from the corner of the room. Turning, he saw a figure huddled in the shadows, its back turned towards him. "Emily?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own heartbeat. The figure turned slowly, and Max felt his blood run cold as he met its gaze. It was Emily, but she was no longer the bright-eyed girl he had once known. Her eyes were empty, hollow, as if the light had been extinguished from within. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" Max's heart broke at the sound of her voice, but before he could respond, Emily spoke again, her words sending a chill down his spine. "They did terrible things to us here, Max," she said, her voice filled with a pain that cut him to the core. "And now, they want to do the same to you." With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max realized that the hospital's dark secrets ran deeper than he had ever imagined. And if he wasn't careful, he could become their next victim. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he looked into Emily's hollow eyes, his mind reeling with shock and disbelief. He had found her, but she was no longer the vibrant girl he had once known. She was a shell of her former self, haunted by the horrors of the hospital. "Emily," Max whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "What happened to you?" Emily's gaze flickered, a faint glimmer of recognition crossing her face. I don't know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "One day, I was here with you, and the next, I was gone." Max's heart broke at the sound of her voice. But before he could respond, a sudden noise echoed through the room, sending a chill down his spine. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer with each passing second. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max knew that they weren't alone in the hospital. Someone, or something, was hunting them. And if they didn't find a way out soon, they would become its next victims. "Emily, we have to go," Max said, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here any longer." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with fear. Together, they made their way through the deserted corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps behind them seemed to draw ever closer. Suddenly, they rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of figures blocking their path. They were dressed in tattered hospital gowns, their eyes vacant and their expressions blank. Max's heart raced as he realized what they were: the hospital's former patients, trapped in a never-ending nightmare of pain and suffering. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max knew that they were in grave danger. But before he could react, the figures lunged forward, their hands reaching out to grab him and Emily. In a panic, Max reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating the room with a dim, ghostly light. With a surge of adrenaline, he held it out like a makeshift weapon, hoping to ward off their attackers. But it was too late. The figures closed in on them, their hands closing around Max and Emily's throats, choking the life out of them. As darkness closed in around him, Max realized that they were doomed, trapped in the hospital's twisted grip forever. Max's head swam with confusion as he slowly regained consciousness. His surroundings were hazy and indistinct, and for a moment, he wasn't sure where he was or how he had gotten there. As his senses gradually returned, Max realized that he was lying on the floor of the small room where he had found the classified documents. His head throbbed with pain, and his throat burned with each labored breath. With a groan, Max pushed himself into a sitting position, his mind spinning with disorientation. He couldn't remember how he had ended up here, or what had happened to Emily and the other patients. It was as if the events of the past few hours had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as Max glanced around the room, his eyes fell upon the documents scattered on the floor, their contents too shocking to dismiss. The memories came flooding back in a rush, and Max realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that what he had experienced was all too real. With a trembling hand, Max reached out to touch the documents, his fingers tracing the faded ink on the yellowed pages. He had to find out what had happened to Emily, had to uncover the truth behind the hospital's dark past. As he sifted through the documents, Max's mind raced with questions. Who had conducted the illegal experiments on the patients? And why had they been covered up for so long? But before he could find any answers, a sudden noise echoed through the room, sending a chill down Max's spine. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer with each passing second. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Max realized that he wasn't alone in the hospital. Someone, or something, was hunting him, and if he didn't find a way out soon, he would become its next victim. With a surge of adrenaline, Max scrambled to his feet and made his way towards the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find Emily, had to make sense of the nightmares that had plagued him since he had set foot in the hospital. But as he reached for the doorknob, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him, and he stumbled backwards, his vision swimming with darkness. With a last desperate effort, Max reached out to steady himself, but it was too late. The world spun around him, and with a final gasp, he sank into unconsciousness once more. Max's head throbbed as he slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, and he found himself lying on the floor of the small room once more. The memories of his ordeal flooded back to him in a rush, and he pushed himself up onto his elbows, his mind spinning with disorientation. With a groan, Max glanced around the room, his eyes falling on the scattered documents that lay on the floor. He remembered finding them earlier, remembered the shock and horror he had felt as he read through their contents. Determined to uncover the truth behind the hospital's dark past, Max reached out and gathered up the documents, tucking them securely into his backpack. He knew that he couldn't leave them behind. They were the key to unlocking the secrets of the hospital, and he was determined to see justice done. With a last glance around the room, Max pushed himself to his feet and made his way towards the door. His head still throbbed with pain, but he pushed aside his discomfort and focused on the task at hand. As he stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, Max's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that he had to find a way out of the hospital, had to escape the nightmare that had consumed him for far too long. With a sense of determination, Max set off down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He kept his senses sharp, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. After what felt like an eternity, Max finally reached the exit, the cool night air washing over him like a balm. With a sense of relief, he stepped out into the darkness beyond, his heart pounding with adrenaline. But as he made his way back to his car, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the hospital loomed behind him, silent and empty. With a last look back at the abandoned building, Max climbed into his car and started the engine. As he drove away, the memories of his ordeal faded into the distance, but he knew that they would stay with him forever. But no matter how far he drove, Max knew that the truth would always be waiting for him, lurking in the shadows, ready to be uncovered. Max's journey home was a blur of exhaustion and relief. His head throbbed with pain, and his body ached with every movement. But as he pulled into his driveway and stumbled into his house, he felt a sense of overwhelming gratitude wash over him. He was alive, and that was all that mattered. With a sigh of relief, Max collapsed onto his bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. 24 hours passed in a blur, and when Max finally woke up, he felt as though he had been asleep for a lifetime. As he lay in bed, the events of the past few days came flooding back to him in a rush. The abandoned hospital, the terrifying encounters, the classified documents he had found. It all seemed like a distant nightmare, but Max knew that it was all too real. With a sense of determination, Max made his way to his desk and retrieved the documents from his backpack. He spread them out on the table before him, his heart pounding with anticipation. He knew that they held the key to uncovering the truth behind the hospital's dark past, and he was determined to see justice done. For the next week, Max threw himself into his investigation with single-minded focus. He combed through the documents, cross-referencing names and dates, piecing together the puzzle one piece at a time. But as he delved deeper into the hospital's history, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder every time he left the house, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. And then, one day, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Max in a plain, unmarked envelope. His hands shook as he tore it open, his heart sinking as he read the words printed on the page. Mr. Harris, the letter read, "We strongly advise you to cease your investigation into the events at the abandoned hospital. You are meddling in affairs that do not concern you, and if you continue to stick your nose where it doesn't belong, you will regret it. Destroy the documents you have found, and forget about the hospital if you want to stay alive." Max's blood ran cold as he read the letter, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Who had sent it? And why were they so determined to silence him? But despite the threats, Max knew that he couldn't turn back now. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and he was determined to see justice done, no matter the cost. With a sense of grim determination, Max tucked the letter into his pocket and returned to his investigation. He knew that he was treading on dangerous ground, but he also knew that he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. The truth was worth fighting for, and Max was ready to do whatever it took to uncover it. Despite the threats and warnings, Max couldn't let go of his investigation. His determination only grew stronger as he delved deeper into the secrets of the abandoned hospital. He followed every lead, uncovered every piece of evidence, unwilling to let fear stand in the way of justice. But the shadows that lurked in the hospital's past were darker and more dangerous than Max could have ever imagined. As he got closer to the truth, the threats against him grew more frequent and more sinister. One night, as Max worked tirelessly at his desk, piecing together the final pieces of the puzzle, he heard a noise outside his window. He glanced up, his heart pounding with apprehension, but saw nothing but darkness. Brushing it off as his imagination, Max returned to his work, unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond his door. The next morning, Max's lifeless body was found in his home, surrounded by the documents he had fought so hard to uncover. The cause of death was unclear, with no signs of foul play or struggle. Some speculated that Max had been driven to madness by his relentless pursuit of the truth, while others whispered of darker forces at work. But one thing was certain: Max's death was a tragedy, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the past. And thus ends the story of Maxwell Harris, the fearless investigator who dared to confront the unknown. Though his journey may have ended in tragedy, his legacy lives on in the hearts of those who dare to seek the truth, no matter